Let's try and get some perspective on this right now and join our three guests, three political and international affairs commentators, Marko Gasic, Paul Ingram and Chris Banbury. A very warm welcome to all three of you here for joining us on the Friday evening programme in Moscow. I wanted to ask you first, the West is talking up a Russian invasion of Ukraine, while Russia blames the West for warmongering hysteria. So ultimately, who is to blame for the spiralling tensions at the moment? Let's go to Chris Banbury. Over to you for this, please.
I think the key issue here is the expansion of NATO and the breaking of the promise made to Mikhail Gorbachev that the former satellite states of the USSR would not allowed to join the NATO. That promise has been broken, and we've seen NATO expansion. And I think you don't have to be a supporter of Vladimir Putin to understand Russian fears of what would happen if Ukraine was allowed to join NATO. The memories of 1941 are still raw in Russia, and therefore there are real fears in Russia that they are being encircled. NATO is a North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It has now moved substantially away from just being concerned with NATO. And I take the stuff about human rights. I mean, look at the United States, look at the UK in terms of the key players in NATO. What are they doing in Yemen, for instance, helping the Saudis with a vicious war which is going on there? Where is their concern about human rights in Saudi Arabia? So I take all of this with a strong pinch of salt.
So you're taking it with a strong pinch of salt, Chris. But let's go over to Marko Gasic. You look like you're itching to make a comment on this, Marko. Carry on.
Well, I'd take it with a big glass of brandy or something stronger, because we're in a bit of a dangerous situation here, certainly. As far as Russia is concerned, the US's intention, Washington's intention to put in so-called defensive missiles, which can be converted into offensive ones within about an hour, is an existential threat to Russia itself. So for Russia, it's an existential threat. For the US, it may be a tactic. It may be, let's put the Russians into this invidious position where they can't avoid doing something unpleasant back to warn us off, and we'll use that something back in order to lock the Western Europe into this US-UK security architecture, lock Russia out in perpetuity, and lock the EU in to the embrace of Washington in perpetuity. That seems to be a win-win idea as far as Washington's concerned. I think that's what
Putin has said a number of times, sorry to jump in, Marko, but Putin has said a number of times that the whole containment policy of Russia continues to date. Paul Ingram, if I can bring you in for a second, UK tabloids are saying 100,000 Russian troops are poised to invade, also noting that the ground is too muddy for Putin's tanks, and yet all the while Moscow refutes all these claims. How do you clear the fog, Paul?
Well, it's a very good question. And it actually is the question, because whatever the rights and wrongs of this situation, the damage to European security, not only the risk of war, which itself is huge, but also the capabilities of these states to cooperate to tackle the existential risks that face the world. How can people seriously negotiate in Glasgow around climate change when they're about to go to war against each other? This is serious, and whilst I don't disagree with anything that's been said up to now in the programme, we have to see beyond the righteousness and try to understand how we can deepen security across the continent. And of course, the way you do that is not through military alliances against each other. The way is to operate through organisations like the OSCE, that up until now has played a reasonably positive role in drawing together past adversaries.
All right, but I want to throw this back to Chris for a second, because one of Moscow's red lines is not having NATO weapons on its borders, which is something that Marko was referring to. Russia views this as a real threat to its security. And if we just look back for a moment to the Cuban Missile Crisis, in effect, it's much the same, but in reverse. So why doesn't the US and NATO understand Moscow's concerns, Chris?
I think you've drawn an interesting comparison. The Monroe Doctrine is something which the United States has enforced in South America. But I think you've got to understand is that the situation in the world today is that economically the United States is slipping. We've seen the rise of China. The United States still remains the military hegemon and is keen, as we've seen in the last 20 years, to use that military might to enforce its position in the world in regards to China in particular, and indeed to Russia. And I think with this new Cold War, what we're seeing is a change of boundary. I'm not surprised that, given the nature of the government of Poland, and given actually some of the nature of some of the spat that's going on between Lithuania and China, that these governments are very keen to egg on America and NATO to continue to put NATO troops and the missile defense system, which is alluded to, into the Baltic states, into those societies there. And we should also remember something else. Georgia did launch a war with Russia. You know, and it was backed up by America and Britain, etc., although they didn't militarily intervene. And we have seen in recent weeks in the Black Sea, American, British and French warships involved in naval maneuvers and going both to Ukraine and to Georgia. That would seem to me quite provocative in the current situation to have British American ships entering as well Russian waters. That is a major provocation.
You're talking about provocations there, Chris. I mean, let's put it back to Marko here. Marko, who is provoking who, do you think, in this situation?
Well, if you think about the Iraq War, and the excuse of the Iraq War being that Saddam Hussein had missiles potentially 45 minutes from London, we have here in Ukraine the plan to be missiles 5 minutes from Moscow, 7 minutes from Russia's strategic nuclear defenses. In effect, Russia will have a knife to its throat and not enough time to recover if it allows these in. Russia will have to stop those missiles coming in. This is Cuba Missile Crisis Part 2. It could end differently from that one if we don't look at this very carefully. The other element of this is the idea that Ukraine, if NATO ever wanted it to be part of NATO, actually became a part of NATO, because that would in effect give Ukraine the ability to launch an international war on behalf of its own Kievan interests there. And the Kievan politicians are completely irresponsible on this question. So that would be another madcap move in this mad strategy coming from Joe Biden's administration.
Marko, let's throw it back to Paul one more time here. Yeah, Paul, I wanted to ask you, though, you know, the two sides, they almost have to learn to trust each other again, Paul. Or do you think too much damage has already been done?
It's never too late, and trust takes time. It's not something that you can snap your fingers at.
Oh dear, I think we've just lost the connection with Paul there. I do apologise here. We've lost the connection with Paul Ingram there, standing by as we were doing this panel discussion here on essentially what is going on with NATO up inside on the western border, essentially, of Russia, that is that of the eastern border of Ukraine. Let's bring it back to Marko one more time. Marko, the two sides have at least been talking a little bit this week. That's got to be something optimistic, do you think?
Jaw is better than war, but as both sides have said, the outcome is the key thing. The problem is that there are, in many ways, the US publicly has boxed itself into a bit of a corner in terms of its public pronouncements, and it's difficult to see how it can row back from those except by making behind closed doors promises of the kind that the Russians have already rejected on the count of the fact they've never been fulfilled, as Chris referred to at the beginning of this program. So essentially, it is a very difficult situation, but of course, talk is better than the alternative, and we hope it will lead to something. I think the key point here is missiles and NATO membership. Obviously, NATO has itself got a rule about not allowing countries with outstanding territorial disputes to actually come into NATO. That may be a useful thing to remember at this point, but certainly the missile issue is absolutely deadly for world security, and it requires some of the things that Paul is probably going to tell us if he comes back about in order to de-escalate.
Let's bring it back to Paul one more time here. Marko, thanks for that. Jens Stoltenberg is saying Ukraine will still be supported to become that of a NATO member. That's another key Russian red line, Paul. What do you think is going to happen with that?
Oh, I really don't think there's any chance of Ukraine joining NATO anytime soon. Everybody in the US and the rest of NATO recognises that would be crossing a very significant red line. I think Putin's actions over the last few weeks will have underlined that. So I think if there's anything positive that has come out of this crisis, it is that the West will recognise that it can't get away scot-free by bringing Ukraine into NATO. It would be utterly mad for them to do so.
Let's bring it back to Chris one more time, because, Chris, I wanted to ask you, when you look at, for example, the UK media over the past number of weeks, it's been really just banging those war drums. A lot of it's been very tabloidy, though, talking about Putin's tanks can't get through the mud because it's too wet, talking about 100,000 Russian soldiers poised to invade. I mean, it's almost like the media is banging the war drums louder than the politicians themselves, Chris.
Well, that doesn't really surprise me much of the British media, and you know, we've got stories flying around. I mean, for instance, yesterday there was a MI5 was saying there's this Chinese lawyer in the Houses of Parliament operating on behalf of Beijing. I mean, what the veracity of that is, I don't know, but there are so many Americans there who've got ties to the American administration and security forces in the British Parliament. Why don't they mention this? So we're seeing a lot of propaganda, both about Russia and indeed about China. And we should not forget that in this new Cold War, there is also the Chinese fears of encirclement with the alliance America's made with Taiwan, Japan, etc. in the East, and the naval maneuvers we've seen there. So I come back to my point. This is about America imposing itself, not just in terms of Russia, but also imposing itself in Europe, because it's a way of disciplining particularly the Germans. Under Angela Merkel, the Germans were not really prepared to follow America's war drums. They weren't prepared to escalate the military spending as Washington required. There's now a new administration in Germany, the key force in the European Union. And I think this is also about bringing the Germans into the line. They know they can rely on the French and the British when push comes to shove, no matter what. But I think they want to try and bring the Germans into their much nearer into their orbit. So there's another element to that agenda going on there. But I return to my point. You know, NATO encirclement was always going to lead to tensions. Once you have NATO forces in the Baltic states, once you have NATO forces in Poland and Czechoslovakia elsewhere, in Georgia and the Black Sea, once you have that, it revives Russian fears. And as I say, you don't have to be a fan of Vladimir Putin to understand what those fears are, given Russians' recent history, given what happened in the Second World War. So I think talk is better than war. So I hope we can actually return and contain ourselves at the negotiating table and de-escalate this situation. Because, as you say, some of the coverage here in Britain is absolutely virulent. I mean, it's as if they want us to go to a war. The idea of Britain taking on Russia is almost preposterous. So, of course, it's only Britain hanging on to the coattails of the United States.
But they're saying it. But they've been saying it for years now, Chris. I mean, you go back to 2014, Maidan, what Western leaders like to call it was a political process. That was a clear case of regime change out of Langley, Virginia. I mean, it was blatant to almost anybody, but the Western media was always given a different side to it. Marko, sorry, Chris, go on.
I was going to say, it's clear that there is a process of regime change across the world, wherever there is governments which don't fit with the neoliberal order which is controlled essentially by the United States through the IMF, GATT, etc., etc., etc. So they will always bring down any government, or try to bring down any government which doesn't correspond to those interests.
But I just want to say, but we're getting a somewhat cynical look from Paul at the moment. Paul, you want to jump in here and say something?
No, I just wanted to say that I don't disagree with what Chris is saying, but I also think that we need to be careful about just sliding into just a confrontational approach towards these sorts of interests and developments, because they are incredibly powerful. And the big question that all of us, whether we are commentators in the West or the Russian government or anyone else, is how do you deal with a bully? And the way of dealing with a bully is not just to face up to them and then get smashed in. You have to deal with it very cleverly, and you have to try and build relationships and positive connections. And the way in which Putin has managed to do that in the past with Angela Merkel and some other European governments to some limited success has been incredibly valuable and important. Well, and I think that's the approach that needs to be taken.
I think you make a really good point, Paul. I think it's a very good point, but it's a point that Marko is itching to pounce on. Over to you, Marko.
Yeah, I mean, 2 points. I'm not quite sure who Paul means by the bully in this scenario, but one thing that is vitally important for the future of the planet is that Russia is included in a new security architecture. You can't have a new security architecture, or even an old one, with Russia labeled as the enemy, with Ukraine massing half its army as closer to the Russian border as it can, without any commentary from the Western media, and NATO politicians referring to Russia as the enemy. You cannot have stability, because Russia, of course, perceives itself as the victim of where this is heading. It has to be included in security architecture. Otherwise, there's no security for anybody.
I couldn't agree more. But just to clarify, by the bully, I meant the United States. Particularly under President Trump. And of course, because Biden's room for maneuver domestically is so limited because of the way in which US politics is so dysfunctional, the bullying continues into this administration.
Paul, thanks for that. Just one more time, over to Chris. I'm running out of time here, gentlemen. It's been lovely having you, but one more question here, and a very, very quick question to you, Chris, if I may. A new report, one of our top stories today, a report unconfirmed at this point, but Ukrainian special operations soldiers and instructors reportedly getting training by US commandos on US soil. How does that affect the current situation? You've got 30 seconds, Chris.
It doesn't surprise me, but we should look at the Ukrainian government. There's a lot of talk about Moscow, there's a lot of talk about Russia and civil rights, etc. We should look at what's happening in Ukraine, where it's a very right-wing nationalist government. So it's not just simply sort of the good Ukrainians versus the bad Russians. This is rather more complicated here, and the West needs to get some decent coverage about what is going on in Ukraine.
All right, Chris Banbury, Paul Ingram, Marko Gasic, our international affairs commentators joining us live on this Friday programme. A great pleasure having you with us. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.